Hi, I'm Allie with the Sacramento History Museum, and thank you for joining us for another Museum Monday. Now this month we've been talking all about extreme weather phenomenon here in Sacramento. So far we've talked about fire, drought, and heat. And now we're going to talk about something that might seem like it's polar opposite, but is actually very related to those phenomena. We're going to talk about flood. And it's actually a beautiful day here, not the heat waves, drought, and fires we've been experiencing, though there is still some smoke in the air from the fires. And we are here on the bank of the Sacramento River to talk about flooding that happened here in Sacramento in the past and might happen again in the future. In fact, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency says that Sacramento is the #1 most at-risk metropolitan area for a future flood. And that's a little bit problematic because we've had a lot of floods and they have been devastating. In recent decades that you might remember, we had a flood in 1986, in 1995, in 1997, in 2006, and in 2017, just 4 years ago. But that wasn't when these flood troubles began. They've been going on for just about as long as people have been here, and probably longer. Where we are in Sacramento City is at the intersection of the Sacramento River and then the American River. And we are in a slightly sunken valley just above sea level. So this is a very large and wide floodplain area. And some early explorers to this area already noticed that it was prime for flood conditions. In fact, Edwin Bryant, who observed the California scene in 1846 to 1847, referred to the Sacramento River thusly: in the rainy season and in the spring, when the snows on the mountains are melting, it overflows its banks in many places. Simple to the point, this area flooded. That's why it was so popular with the Nisenan, the Native Americans who were here in the past, because this made for a very fertile area that seasonal flooding was advantageous. So they didn't choose to live right on the banks like we do today, but they leaned into this flooding. When our immigrants came, they didn't lean into it as much. They decided to fight it. Another gentleman who came to this area said his name was the Reverend Walter Colton, and he said that the town has been swept by one inundation after another from the overflow of the Americano, referring to the American River. It came upon the inhabitants like a thief in the night. They had only time to jump from their beds. The roaring flood was at their heels. Some reached the shipping, and some sprung into the tops of the trees. But a levee is now going up, which will help shut out the flood, and that was written in 1849, right after our first horrible flood. So in the winter of 1849 and 1850, one of the greatest floods yet known occurred in this area. It flooded about 1/3 of the entire Sacramento Valley region, and here in the city, it flooded about 4/5 of the city overnight, within hours. So the American River overflowed its banks on January 8, 1850. And at that time, the town was primarily made of hastily constructed wood and canvas buildings from predominantly ships that had been coming up here from the gold rush. And so these buildings quickly washed away or were destroyed by these floodwaters. Many were rescued from their homes in boats, and the ever entrepreneurs of our city kind of capitalized on the situation in a really greedy way. There are records of some people charging $1,000 to purchase a boat for rescue during this flood, or renting them for $30 an hour. So despite what disaster there is, there's always going to be someone who wants to capitalize. During this flood, it was actually business as usual. The water lasted for a bit of time, and after the initial shock, people continued working out of their second story or their roofs, staying in local boarding houses or hotels. In fact, a small steamboat actually ran up K Street and started just delivering off into a local store, the Star Bensley and Company building. By the time the floodwaters finally receded, it was estimated that there was about $1 million in damage from this flood. And so the city's first mayor, Hardin Bigelow, rallied around the idea of building a levee. And that's what I'm standing on right now. This is one of many levees you've probably seen throughout the Sacramento region. So he was able to rally people to create a levee from Sutterville along the Sacramento River all the way to its confluence with the American River. And then along the American River, it went all the way up to what they deemed higher ground, about where Sutter's Landing is. And the city was willing to do this. They willingly raised their taxes to build this levee. It was actually a special $250,000 tax assessment that they approved almost unanimously for building this permanent levee. Didn't work quite as hoped, however. There was still more flooding. In 1852, And 1853, we flooded yet again. Wasn't quite as disastrous because of this levee, but it still required some ingenuity to continue being here. And so the merchants were concerned about the long-term viability of Sacramento. They were also concerned about losing their status as the capital. The capital had been moving around a bit at this point, and they had just secured Sacramento as the permanent capital of California, and they thought this flooding could lead to that not being the same anymore. So they paid to reinforce the levee. They also built some additional levees, so there was an R Street levee, and they furthered the American River levee so that those levees kind of created a bowl all the way around Sacramento, protecting it, or so they had hoped. The business district, which is where we're standing here, what you might know as the old Sacramento waterfront, this used to be the business district, and they also did some slight high-grade adjustments. So they filled in the streets and the area here right by the river with dirt, up about 5 feet. All right, now that was all well and good. Spent about $600,000 to protect the city from all of this, and then Sacramento had about a 10-year drought. It was lovely here. The city flourished, building expanded, brick buildings were built after we had a few fires in addition to those floods, and they thought we had truly decided to best Mother Nature and were happy to stay here until the Great Flood of 1861-1862. This is the largest flood in recorded history, not only here in California, but also in Oregon and Nevada. It occurred from December 1861 to January 1862, though the water stayed at a high level for about 3 months. It was preceded by weeks and weeks of rain and snow in very high elevations starting around November, and then there were some arc storms, atmospheric river storms with warm rain. And that warm rain actually led to an early snow melt, which rushed the water down the Feather and American rivers to where we are now. Now, this flood was not just a California phenomenon. Combined, all the way from the Columbia rivers in western Oregon through California, down even as far as San Diego, and over as far inland as Idaho and Nevada, even a little bit of Utah, there was flooding. Over a period of 43 days in the form of rain and snow, over 30 feet of rainfall happened in California. And there was more flooding that would continue in Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, and the country of Mexico in the spring as more of this snow melted off. So here in Sacramento, how did that get experienced? On the morning of December 9th, 1861, the levee on the northeastern part of Sacramento, so I'm not sure exactly where, but could be around where we are, it succumbed. The American River was rising. In fact, the day before the levee broke, it had risen 20 feet in just one day. And so the levee succumbed, the water rushed into the city, but remember we have all these other levees. So the water didn't really rush out anywhere. A bit of a problem. And this was the highest floodwaters they had ever seen. The Union reported that the flood came with the rapidity of a hurricane, and then it needed to be relieved right away. And so the city hired a chain gang, probably prisoners, I was loose when I said hired there, and they gave them the dangerous task of breaking through the R Street levee so that the water would have somewhere to go. When they were finally able to achieve that, the force of the water rushing out from the levees was so strong that 25 houses, including some 2-story houses, were washed down the Central Valley. Now, you might think that meant the flood was over, but it was not. On December 23rd, we flooded again. And on January 9th, we had a storm that the U.S. Geological Survey says occurs only once every 200 years, another one of those arc storms, atmospheric river currents. And this entire area, as I said, was underwater for 3 months. You could take a boat all the way from here to Bakersfield. It was a huge inland lake in the Central Valley. By the end, when all of the water finally receded, 400 families were left homeless, and over 5,000 people were in need of aid. So, what did we do? Well, I could tell you all about that, but there's a tour you could go on. It's called the Underground Tour. But as a short summary, we built some more levees, lifted them higher. We knew that wasn't enough from the levees trapping water in, so we also lifted our city and moved the American River. That's why you're not looking at it today. But again, you can go on an underground tour for that. Not too interesting in our talk of floods today, but I do want to talk about those more modern floods, because despite all of the efforts they did to lift Sacramento up to the high grade, and you can see I am quite a bit higher than that original water level, flooding still occurred. So in 1986, there was a Pineapple Express storm. So this is a vigorous low pressure system that drifted east from the Pacific Ocean and lasted throughout most of the month of February. It released 10 inches of rain in an 11-day period, and those floodwaters were strong. They literally tore bridges from their foundations. At the end of it, there were 13 deaths, 50,000 people were evacuated, and over $400 million in property damage. In 1995, the next storm, less than a decade later, there were heavy rains that hit the Sacramento area and caused localized flooding. It wasn't as bad as that 1986 storm, but if you were in the Arcade area, Morrison area, Florin, Union, or Dry Creek areas, there was pretty high flooding up to waist level for most people. In 1997, just 2 years later, tropical storms hit, and the Cosumnes River levee was broken in 24 different places. In 2006, that possibly well known if you've been in the area for a while flood was called the New Year's Eve storm. It soaked the entire region for most of the first few days of New Year's Eve. And although this flood event was not of the magnitude of those in the past, it really was an awakening for citizens here in the city to remember that flood is a constant problem. Even when we're entering drought, even when there's fires and heat, flood is still a threat to our city. And we remember that again, excuse me, with our most recent flood in 2017. Sorry, allergies everyone. I remember this flood very well because I was living in Natomas at the time, when I would have to drive over the American River every day to get to work at the Sacramento History Museum. And I kept wondering if those floodwaters were actually going to go up over the highway system. So we left the American River low. That's why that area is a designated floodplain, and it does flood in many years. It's a protective measure. That area is designed to flood. We don't build structures there to try to make it so we can protect the rest of the city. But that storm started January 3rd, 2017 and went through January 24th. Water from storm systems, king tides, releases, and runoff impacted several areas of our county. Rio Linda, Point Pleasant, Glanville, and Wilton excuse me, received the worst of it. But still, here in Sacramento, there were some localized flooding once again, streets that had to be closed. And so, what's next for us? There are over 370 miles of Sacramento County that are considered to be in the 100-year floodplain. So there is still lots of our area that is at risk of flood in the future. And remember when I talked about that 1861, 1862 flood, they said on January 9th we had a storm that the U.S. Geological Survey says comes once every 200 years or so? We're getting really close to that 200-year mark. So it could be that another storm is coming. And as climate change increases the heat, the risk of those warm tropical arc storms that can melt the snow early in the season and cause that rush of water become higher. So I leave it on all of you, as many of our underground tour guides do, to figure out what we should do to protect our city in the future. We've built levees, we've moved a river, we've raised the city, but flood is an ever-present concern. And we don't know quite how to solve that just yet. So thank you so much for joining me for Museum Monday. We hope to see you again next week. Delta Picmella will be doing her monthly story time. Thanks.